All right, guys, thank you for that first carrier update this morning. Great to be back with y'all. Right now, we're going to welcome our air cargo editor, Eric Coolish, calling in this morning on the phone. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Kaylee, thanks so much for having me on. I'm on the road here on a little vacation, but I thought I'd pop in on the show and join you guys, talk a little air cargo.
We appreciate having you here as always. I just returned from on the road myself, so it's great to be back in the FreightWaves Now shoes. Let's talk about kind of what's going on with the fallout from Russian sanctions right now and how that's impacting the air cargo market.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on, and as we've talked about before, a fair amount of air cargo capacity has been pulled out of the market and impacted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all this back and forth sanctions. So, a lot of the airlines, Western airlines, can't overfly Russia, so that's taken out, a fair amount of capacity because planes have to reroute and fly around Russia to get to Asia and carry more fuel. And then some of the Russian cargo airlines have stopped operating or can't fly, to the U.S. and Europe and so forth. So that's been the main, capacity constraint. But there's been some recent developments that, I've been following. They're interesting. Last week, the U.S. Targeted a Russian cargo airline called Aviastar for violating the sanctions. When the sanctions, in addition to the airspace closure and cutoff of technology, high-tech sales to Russian airlines, the sanctions also, there were subsequent sanctions that included for certain airlines that you cannot export anything to, and you cannot export any parts to Russian carriers. And so what happened was some of these Russian and then the way the rule reads, an export of anything so basically anything that's made at 25% content in the U.S. or the EU, you can't sell them anything. And so some of these Russian airlines have still been flying their aircraft and moving them back to Russia and so forth, or even flying within Russia. And according to the way the regulations read, that's considered a re-export. Even though you're just flying the plane, you're not selling them a tire or sending them anything in a transaction. That's considered a re-export. It's considered a violation. And so these carriers were operating on their own and flying. And so now they've put on these temporary denial of service sanctions on the Aviastar saying, hey, you violated, nobody can sell you even like a paper clip. So that was, I found interesting. And then a big air leasing company, one of the big ones, Air Lease Corporation, they wrote off more than $800 million in assets that were stranded in Russia that they couldn't recover. The European Union had put on some sanctions that said leasing companies need to, recover or terminate all their leases by the end of March. And so, leasing companies were scrambling to try and recover them, and it's been very difficult. Most of the planes are still with Russian airlines, and part of the reason is because some of the registries in Bermuda and Ireland nullified the air cargo or the airworthiness certificates of the planes because they can't inspect them now under the current conditions. And the Russians retaliated by saying, well, we're just going to transfer all the planes to our Russian registry and let them fly within Russia. And so, these leasing companies are basically stuck with a lot of assets they'll probably never get back. So Air Lease wrote off a big chunk of that. They had about 21 planes and about 27 planes total that stranded there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that's not a good thing to have your assets stuck in a place that gets shut down by sanctions due to war. Lesson learned there. But we have. So, what are some of the other effects that have been happening in Russia that we've not heard about there due to the sanctions on air cargo?
Well, just the overall ripple effects are, as we talked about, the overall capacity decline, but also, higher fuel prices that are impacting all the airlines, whether it's cargo or passenger. And so those are the main impacts. But But from a cargo perspective, the cargo airlines, as we said, some of the capacity's out, and also, there's been attempts to recover some freighter aircraft from Russia. So one of the air cargo or airline consulting companies has found that about a handful of freighters have been recovered or returned, but it's a small amount that these leasing companies have been able to recover. Going back to Aviastar for a second, they had five Boeing 757-200. So that's why they were hit with that enforcement, because they were flying these U.S.-made planes.
Okay, so there were U.S.-made planes into there, and that's interesting to me, Eric. And good morning, by the way. I forgot to say that earlier. I feel rude. Sorry about that. And I'm glad to speak with you again, my friend. I hope your vacation is well. But when they get sanctioned for flying illegally into Russia, how does that occur? If they're leaving from like, say, the United States or one of the NATO countries, or the EU, whatever, don't they have to have a flight plan that's been approved and moving? I mean, you can't take a 747 into the air and then just go on a rogue flight, can you?
Yeah, well, no, that's a good point. And at one point, like a month or so ago, the U.S. Commerce Department, issued a warning to, companies and entities around the world, saying, hey, if you provide any support, indirectly to a Russian airline by refueling them or providing navigation service or doing any maintenance, then one of these airlines that's under sanctions, and then they fly somewhere or fly back to Russia, that's like being an accomplice essentially in a crime, and we could, in theory, hit you with secondary sanctions or come after you. So, yeah, I don't know exactly, how much of those secondary sanctions will be enforced, but early on there was a big scramble to get some of these Russian planes back to Russia. But now that they're there, some of them are flying domestically, and under the rules, if you just pick up and move the plane, that's a violation of the export. It's considered a re-export, and whether it crosses a border or not, and so the sanctions kick in, or the enforcement ramps up.
So, Eric, what are some of those unintended consequences, or maybe things that we're not quite hearing about, from these carriers now having to circumnavigate Russia, now having to adjust their routes? Is it just delays in freight? Are they now having to increase rates to account for the extra fuel that's being used? Are we seeing crew shortages because now people maybe aren't wanting to fly those routes? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of knock-on effects. First of all, if you're flying on those big trunk lanes from Northern Europe or so, you're adding, 2 to 3 hours extra flying time. That's less time the planes can be, operating. If you add those up over a few days, that's a flight or two that's knocked out of an airline's network. And then they have to carry more fuel or either stop to refuel, which adds costs for landing fees, or adding on more fuel. So you're burning more fuel. You have to carry a little less cargo potentially if you're carrying more fuel to make up for that weight balance. And so it's just that's how the capacity is kind of indirectly being siphoned off. Some of the Middle East carriers like Qatar Airways and Emirates, they're seen as beneficiaries of the situation, because now, their routes don't have to be adjusted. They normally fly kind of a southerly route and go through their hubs in Dubai and so forth. And so, they're picking up some of the business because they hub there anyway. And so they're not losing any capacity. And so they're kind of the short-term beneficiaries of the whole situation.
Eric, so on that thread, have we seen any carriers or any folks now start to think of other opportunities to move their freight instead of air cargo? And what have those looked like if people are now starting to kind of choose other ways?
I mean, it's almost like the other way around. More people or companies are still trying to find ways to get into air cargo because of all the congestion and problems on the ocean side. And the situation in Shanghai where the city's locked down and there's congestion or backups at the ports, or those will get worse once the COVID lockdowns lift. And so there's, thoughts that there's going to be a big rush to air cargo when the airports are functioning more normally. So I kind of see it the other way around. There's still huge intensity for using air. But, I don't know exactly. There's also the option of using the China to Europe rail option that was heavily used prior to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but a lot of companies have stopped using that as well because of uncertainty of whether those, transcontinental trains will get through, and so some of that's also flowing to air. So there's a lot of pressure or interest in air.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's certainly a dynamic situation we're going to have to keep watching. You got Shanghai, you got war, you got inflation, you got all these different things that are going on here affecting air cargo and all the other modes. Eric, hey, you have a great vacation and a great rest of your day and weekend, sir, and we'll catch up with you a little bit later. Check out Eric's stuff on freightwaves.com and on American Shipper, too, as well, right? Thank you so much, Eric.